Mr. Patterson. Mr. Patterson. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Present.
Ms. Dell. Ms. Dell. Mr. President, you have quorum.
Thank you. A quorum has been determined and the State Board will proceed with the meeting for tonight. Tonight's meeting is a special working session of the State Board, so we will not conduct reports from leadership committees or the Executive Director. The topic for tonight's special meeting is on the Accountability and Assessment Waiver application proposed by OSSE, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. Representatives from OSSE have joined us tonight to provide details about the waiver request so that the State Board and the public are fully informed. Additional information about the waivers can also be found on OSSE's website, and we encourage the public to provide comments directly to OSSE on their application. Comments provided to the State Board will be incorporated in our official testimony submitted as part of the application to the U.S. Department of Education. We will start with the presentation from OSSE and then turn to questions from members. Superintendent Young, Mr. Tooley, Ms. Johnson, and Ms. Branson, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and you may begin your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give just a couple of remarks for these opening slides and then turn it over to my team. So good evening, President Parker and members of the State Board of Education. As you know, I'm Shauna Young, the Interim State Superintendent of Education. And I'm joined, as you mentioned, by my team, Danielle Branson, the Director of Assessments, Donna Johnson, Director of Accountability, and Justin Tooley, Deputy Chief of Staff. I appreciate your flexibility with us in hosting this special working session to discuss the district's assessment and accountability waiver from provisions of the Every Student Succeeds Act. It was important to me to have a conversation with you on our waiver prior to our submission and to answer your questions. OSSE is committed to providing public stakeholders with accurate, accessible, and actionable data on the performance of our schools. The information that our statewide assessment provides is a critical part of this endeavor. It is the one statewide measure that assesses to what extent all of our students are meeting our rigorous statewide academic standards as approved by this board, and that information is important for a multitude of decisions. This commitment requires us to take the validity of our statewide assessment seriously and to ensure that the data we publish is clear and accurate. As you know, the ongoing global coronavirus pandemic has limited in-person student learning for the 2021 school year. And as we made preparations to administer our statewide assessments with an in-person and remote option, it became clear that administration would be a significant challenge that would threaten the goal of publishing clear and accurate data. That is why the Office of the State Superintendent of Education is requesting a waiver to suspend statewide summative assessments for students in spring 2021 and to suspend the calculation of new STAR ratings for the 2021 school year. This evening, my staff and I will walk you through the components of our waiver request for the U.S. Department of Education. We look forward to answering your questions and look to the State Board of Education to support our waiver request. Yet I want to be clear that this waiver is not a list of excuses about why we can't administer the statewide assessment, and it's not a resignation that there will be no information on how our students are progressing academically. On the contrary, it's a continued expression of our dedication to providing the public with meaningful, actionable data on the performance of our schools and using that information to make decisions. We'll provide the public information on school level performance despite the very real constraints that we face at this time. The waiver request is responsive to our local needs to understand the impact that this pandemic has had on student outcomes so that we can adequately respond while also giving our schools the ability to focus on reopening and student support. We hope that we make this case clearly in our waiver request. Over the past several weeks, OSSE has had constructive communication with staff from the U.S. Department of Education regarding our waiver and the circumstances that we're facing. And we believe that we'll be able to get an approvable waiver plan with the department through this process. Your support of our waiver proposal is critical to that effort. We plan to submit our waiver request after the public comment period ends on April 2nd, and we encourage the board and other public stakeholders to provide written comments to osse.assessment@dc.gov as part of the request. I will now turn it over to Danielle Branson with more specifics on our waiver request related to assessments.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. We can go to the next slide. And the next slide. Thank you for hearing us on this important issue. I want to start by first talking a little bit about what we're going to go through today. We're going to go through the executive summary first, talk about the waiver components, the rationale for why we are submitting a waiver request at this time, an analysis of the flexibilities provided by USCD, as well as the important section on how we intend to support the advancement of academic achievement in the absence of statewide testing data. And then we'll give a reminder on our timeline and next steps. Next slide, please. I want to start by reinforcing the superintendent's earlier statement on our deep commitment to statewide testing and belief in the power of using high quality data. Given the many uses of our assessment data, from the report card to our My School DC application website to research, local decision making, and so many more applications, it is critical that assessment results are fair, reliable, comparable, and valid for a wide variety of interpretations. Due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on our schools, our ability to report out accurate data responsibly is threatened. As a result, we are requesting a 1-year waiver for the following requirements in ESSA. The statewide assessment requirements for our ELA, mathematics, science, and alternate summative assessments, as well as a 95% participation requirement. Next slide, please. If our waiver is approved, we believe that we will be able to preserve very critical and limited instructional time at the end of the year, needed for coverage of standards, for targeted resources for students, and for reentry and transition to in-person learning for many of our students who are transitioning their posture this spring. We also believe we will be able to support our LEAs in the delivery of interim assessments that will support immediate decision-making and instructional choices and supports for students, both in the spring and in the summer, as we transition towards summer planning. Approval of the waiver request will also allow us to implement a responsive and more comprehensive approach to collecting and reporting information that will help contextualize the impact of our learning this year. Finally, we believe that through this waiver, we will be able to maintain our commitment to responsible reporting and the use of our statewide summative assessment data to drive programmatic change. Next slide, please. In support of our waiver requests to USCD, we are making the following commitments. First, we are asking for a 1-year waiver, as stated earlier, for our PARC and MSAA assessments, MSAA being our alternate assessment in ELA and mathematics, our DC science assessment, and our alternate assessment in science dynamic learning maps, as well as a statewide assessment 95% participation requirement. We are proposing the continuation of the administration of our access for ELLs and alternate access English language proficiency assessments. These have in-person only administration and will have an extended testing window through the end of the 2020-2021 school year. And this has been communicated with our LEAs. We also commit to collecting and sharing information publicly. We intend to collect information about our local interim assessments, as well as a suite of previously and newly collected data on student outcomes and experiences. Next slide, please. We are also committing to investing in publicly available research on our statewide educational outcomes as a result of this collection of either previously collected and newly collected data. We are also going to be requiring communication with families and caregivers in a timely manner on the outcomes of our local assessments. This is as a result of the collection of the interims, benchmarks, and end-of-year assessments. In service of this, we are asking LEAs to submit their plans for how their schools are using their local assessments to drive instruction, to support additional programmatic interventions, to direct funding, and in particular for our students most at risk. And finally, we are going to be using our data from OSSE's perspective to support our schools and LEAs for state-provided supports, technical assistance, professional learning, as well as embedding it into our annual monitoring and oversight process. Next slide, please. So now I want to share a little bit of information on our rationale for submitting this waiver at this time. All of these components are included in the draft waiver that's out for public comment now. First, we start by saying that the district is a unique jurisdiction due to its size and the percentage of students receiving instruction in a distance learning posture. And due to the pandemic, there are unique circumstances for our families and our schools that do support our request for this waiver. But we want to focus a lot on the technical aspects of why we are requesting this waiver. The first of these technical aspects is on participation. The vast majority of our students are currently participating in distance learning. This was 96% at the end of term 2, though that is increasing in term 2 and term 4, term 3 and term 4. Due to the in-person only requirement of most of our assessments, there would be very minimal and, more importantly, non-representative participation. Issues of non-representativeness and limited participation threaten the ability to report and interpret the data. Next slide, please. We also call out that the issues of administrative consistency and security are also critical. OSSE underwent significant efforts to try to create standardized administration and security practices for our remote park testing. But we know that there is variation that cannot be controlled. And given the differences and the issues presented by non-secure administration, the accuracy of our data is threatened and the validity of our interpretations is impacted. So broadly, when it comes to interpretation, with the low and not representative participation and the absence of uniformity in test administration and insufficient test security, our test results might not be valid for their intended uses. We will have issues of reliability and comparability, and most importantly, may misrepresent the academic performance of our students in the district. Because we value these assessment data so much, we know that we need to avoid any misrepresentations of the data and what they say. Reporting this spring, we believe, could invite irresponsible claims and use of the data, which could undermine our stakeholders' confidence in future use. Next slide, please. The U.S. Department of Education did provide information on flexibilities they are offering to states. They have stated that they are not providing blanket assessment waivers, but they have offered these flexibilities and indicated that there are some special situations that they may consider, like ours. So we wanted to provide for you a brief analysis of our interpretation of the flexibilities. The first was shortened in the statewide assessments. As you know, in school year 2021, DC was scheduled to administer a more efficient, shorter version of PARC. The endeavor to shorten our assessment took well over a year, took 2 years to do, and was not driven by the pandemic, was driven by our intent to be as efficient as possible. So we were already intending to do that this year. But given the timing, our design constraints, and our consortial requirements, we cannot shorten any of our other existing assessments this year. USCD also offered the option to provide a remote administration. As stated earlier, we underwent significant exploration and planning for remote park administration. And throughout that process, there were still concerns in administration security and equity that we could not alleviate. And no other assessments can be administered remotely at this time. This doesn't mean it may not happen in the future, but at this time they are not available for remote testing. The final flexibility offered by USCD was extending the testing window. We had talked with our LEAs, and extending the testing window, given the reopening of school plans, could not alleviate some of the concerns. We have, however, considered the flexibility for fall testing, but believe that the critical time in that window should be spent on reentry, social emotional well-being, and the important non-summative assessments at the beginning of the year that provide timely data to make immediate instructional decisions for students. Next slide, please. As part of our waiver request, we're required to demonstrate how we will continue to support the advancements of academic achievement without statewide testing data. These commitments are critical for USCD in their review or request, and also critical for us. So we have outlined here how we intend to do this. The first is that we are going to be requiring schools to administer interim, benchmark, or end of course assessments this spring to inform instructional planning. We know that these data do not replace statewide summative data, but they help provide a picture of local performance. We are also intending to require LEAs to submit plans describing their local spring assessments and how they will, in particular, assess all students equitably. We are also asking them to outline their major instructional changes this year due to the impacts of the pandemic and the way in which they're going to be using their data to inform their planning, both in the spring and in the summer. In service of this commitment, we are also requiring LEAs to report to OSSE summary school level data on these local interim, benchmark, or end of year assessments. We are also asking LEAs to report to OSSE information about their academic interventions. And as stated at the beginning, we are also going to continue to administer in-person our English language proficiency assessments with an extended window through the end of the year. And the rationale for that is that this is the only assessment that can be used for students exiting services. There's an individual stakes for this assessment that is not applicable for the other assessments. Next slide, please. The slides that I discussed earlier comprise the full scope as well as argument for our waiver request to the Department of Education, and here's our next steps. On March 19th, we did post publicly our waiver request draft for public comment. We are in the middle of public comment now. It lasts through April 2nd. We have presentations today. And then in the first week of April, we will be reviewing our public comment responses. We will be revising our waiver request, and we intend to submit to USED shortly thereafter. Next slide, please. I can turn it now over to Donna Johnson.
Thank you, Danielle. Good evening, State Board members. Very excited to come and speak with you again tonight. This is going to be a very short portion of the presentation. As all of you remember, I came and spoke with you in January about our intent to file an accountability addendum, which was the flexibilities that were provided by the U.S. Department of Ed at that time are related to accountability. So I'm going to take this opportunity to quickly recap that and then be able to get to your questions. So if we can advance to the next slide, please. Just a quick overview, very similar to what you saw from Danielle's presentation. Just want to outline how we're going to go over things here. We will keep this short and succinct as possible so we can get to your questions. Next step, please. Just a quick reminder for everyone. I know that oftentimes when we talk about accountability and we talk about ESSA, there are a lot of things that we oftentimes think of. And I wanted to just ground us all in what it means to talk about accountability with respect to ESSA. And it really is just talking about these 4 items. It's talking about the long-term goals that are outlined in our ESSA plan. It's talking about the domains of our accountability system. ESSA specifies 5 specific domains, and then we create metrics within those. It's about the system of annual meaningful differentiation. That is the calculation of our STAR framework or STAR ratings for DC. And then it's school improvement, both the designation of schools, the timeline in which they progress, and their exit criteria. Next slides. Quick high-level summary of the accountability waiver. This waiver provides the waiving of calculation and reporting of long-term goals from the 2021 school year. It waives the requirement to calculate STAR scores and ratings. It waives the requirement to adjust any academic achievement metrics based on the participation rate. Oftentimes we think of that as the 95% participation rate. And it waives the requirements to identify any new schools for comprehensive or targeted support. Next slide. Here I've provided, just for your background and understanding, a little background of how we got here. This is the same slide that you saw in January, just with the added information of where we are at the very bottom. US Ed released the new accountability and reporting waiver template on March 8th. So we brought to you the accountability addendum, put that out for public comment. Thank you very much for your letter in support of that addendum. And once we heard from US Ed that they were going to be providing new guidance, we pressed hold to wait for that new guidance, and they released the template. And that's what you're seeing here today for accountability. Next slide, please. A few highlights of the components of the accountability waiver. So in addition to the items that are waived, there is also a commitment that OSSE is making that is required in the waiver to submit the advancement of student achievement, as well as to maintain or improve transparency in how we report information and data to parents and the public. Specifically, they asked for us to make sure that we have comparable, valid, and reliable data that measures how our students are doing academically. We have also committed to making sure that the information that we share with stakeholders is accurate and accessible on the performance of our schools, and we're working with stakeholders so that we will be able to provide this information that is both meaningful, timely, and useful in all of the ways that we know the data is being used, including the improving of programs, looking at how supports are provided to address many of the challenges that our students and our schools are facing. The waiver also asks us to make publicly available data where possible around the reporting of chronic absenteeism, technology access, and other items that they refer to as the opportunity to learn. Some of the things that they called out explicitly were school discipline, teacher, school leader data, and the participation in advanced coursework. As all of you are aware, those are things we already normally report on our report card, and we're looking at the opportunity of how we can report that this year in a way that is meaningful and reflective of the experience that our schools and our students and our community has had around student learning. Next slide, please. Last time we were here, we talked a little bit about the pause on the waiver of school improvement designations, and you asked for a little clarification on those school improvement designations. So this table will help provide that information. We have 4 different school improvement designations that are specifically addressed within this waiver. The first is the one that most of you are most familiar with. That is what we refer to as our Comprehensive Support 1 or CS1 schools. Those are the lowest 5%, which are designated every 3 years. This waiver will essentially move that forward 1 year. 21 was supposed to be a new designation year. This will now shift that forward into 22. CS2 are the comprehensive support schools for schools that are designated purely because they have a low graduation rate of 67% or less. There's no change to this. As you know, we have been able to report graduation rates, and the reporting of graduation rates has not been waived on any of these waivers that we've been provided or that we've requested. So we will continue to report graduation rates. Schools who are currently designated in this designation will be able to exit this year, just as they were able to exit last year if they raise above the 67%. Targeted Support 1 or TS1 is the designation of schools for low student group performance using our STAR framework scores. Obviously, we did not have STAR framework scores last year. Those were waived. Again, through this waiver, without the calculation of STAR framework scores, we would not be able to generate TS1 designations, and those will be waived this year as well. Next fall would have been the first year under our ESSA plan that we would have been calculating what is called TS2 or Targeted Support 2. Those are schools that have chronically underperforming student groups, meaning that they had underperforming student groups that did not improve enough to exit that status. That will also be moved forward because we haven't actually gotten to the point where we've been able to measure those over multiple years to look at that continuation. So the TS1 designation will now have been delayed for 2 years, thus delaying to TS2. Also at the bottom of this slide, you'll see information that you asked about last time, which is where you can access a list of all of those designated schools, and it is available on the DC School Report Card, right on the DC report under School Designation List, and there's a link right there for you. And then the list to the page on the OSSE website where we provide all of the information about the school investments and supports for the comprehensive support schools, including their plans and the supports and the monitoring that has occurred. Next slide, please. This is just recapping that timeline that you just heard from Danielle. And this is outlining the same timeline that we have for the assessment waiver, published last Friday. Public comment period is open now. We gave a presentation, as you heard, this afternoon to our LEA data managers and assessment managers, obviously tonight to you guys, and then we'll be reviewing all of the public comment received. We appreciate your support and hearing your questions. Next slide. Just to recap, this is how you can access the information, where to send public comment. The public comment period is open through April 2nd. And just reiterating some of what we've already said, we really and truly believe in providing accurate and actionable performance data. And we are committed to doing just that and working with our stakeholders to make sure that the information we put out is meaningful, timely, and useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does that complete OSSE's presentation?
It does. We're happy to take questions.
Awesome. Members, we will have one round of questions for 3 minutes. That 3 minutes will include your question and a response from OSSE. Mr. Hayworth will call members in order. And again, before we start, OSSE, I just want to say we know how complex and challenging this situation is. And so again, we appreciate the partnership here in allowing the State Board an opportunity to ask questions and get a better understanding so that we can then turnkey this information to constituents. So with that, Mr. Hayworth, may you call on members.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Come back to me.
Absolutely. Mr. Patterson.
I pass as well right now.
Dr. Reed.
All right, I get this party started. So speaking of, I guess, the meaningful, timely, and useful, 2018, 2019 stars are still up there. Two pieces for that. When will we get possibly updated stars? And can, again, that information be removed, or what would be a consequence of removing that information?
Yeah, thanks for that. As we've mentioned before, the information on the report card is updated annually, and we'll be looking to update the information again this fall, which is when we'd be taking a look again at the information that you said is now a couple of years old. We are certainly interested in having further star ratings. And so part of that will be figuring out what the content and the design of those will be. And so I don't have a particular update on when we would have new ratings. We're certainly committed to that with all the available information we have. But as I mentioned, I think we'll be looking again at maintaining the historical accuracy and availability of that information, but probably doing some updates in the fall.
Okay, thank you. And then for my understanding, the English language proficiency, I was curious about, like, what does that already look like? And then why the need for that population to continue to go through the testing, just kind of for, I just don't know. So I just want to hear about that.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. The access assessment is available and used in a number of different ways, some of which are different than a traditional English ELA or math content assessment. And in part, the access assessment determines a student's English language proficiency. And specifically because that may determine the specific services that a student is provided, or their ability to exit services if they're no longer needed. We felt like it was important and responsive to maintain the eligibility, the availability of that assessment if a student or their teachers thought it was appropriate and they were accessible to take it. So it is not a recall back of students in to take that assessment, but we did feel that it was important to maintain its availability if the students and educators thought it was important to do so.
Thank you. And then just for clarity, the alternate access, is that for individuals with disability who are also English language learners? Okay.
That's right. And Danielle can correct me if I'm wrong there.
Cool. I yield.
Thank you. Ms. Thompson.
I'm curious about the attendance data that you all have to provide. Can you talk to me about just what we're seeing, and like if there are any challenges given the difficulty with engagement this year in particular, like student engagement in this year in particular?
Sure. Well, first, to clarify, we report a couple of different kinds of attendance data at the end of the year, and we report that on our report card, as well as in an annual attendance analysis report. And those include at least two different types of data. One is in-seat attendance, which is the average attendance over the year. The other is the rate of chronic absenteeism for individual students at the school, disaggregated by various different kinds of groups of students. So chronic absenteeism is if you are absent more than 10% of the school days. And so we do monitor that, but we don't do interim reporting. I would say broadly, as we've talked about publicly in other venues, we see a slight uptick in some kinds of absenteeism. We have changed the rules for reporting attendance this year to enable us to report both in the virtual and in the live posture. So students in schools are able to collect that attendance in a couple of different ways and are reporting it on a daily basis to the state.
And with the provision that you all have to identify comprehensive and targeted supports, can you just walk through a bit more, if the waiver was granted, which types of data you would be using and how you would identify and target those supports?
So if the waiver is granted, it gives us a relief to not identify new schools in this year, which was helpful because they're usually identified based on the outcomes of the STAR framework. And because we would not be running the STAR framework, we would not be therefore identifying new schools based on that information. So this actually allows us to push those out a year, so we don't have to identify new schools.
But would there be any shifts, or as far as the schools that you're supporting now? Like what does continued investment look like aside from identifying new schools?
Got it. I'll give a quick update and then I'll allow Donna Johnson to jump in, or ask Donna Johnson also to jump in. Essentially, we have made significant in the comprehensive schools, which is the schools with the lowest ratings on the STAR framework. We're the recipients of approximately $11 million in funding over 3 years. This allows us, we have always been allowed, and we will continue to fund over a 4th year. And this coming year will be that 4th year of funding. So they would continue to receive some statewide funding to support them in plans, specifically to improve outcomes for students at that school. Donna, is there other context there that you think is important to share?
Just a couple of things. Important to know that one of the contingencies, one of the agreements in submitting the waiver is that we are committing to support those schools who are currently designated and to maintain that designation into the next year. That would mean not only just fiscal support, but also the monitoring and the intentionality behind providing and identifying different professional learning opportunities and other supports that OSSE has available, and making sure that they are aware of and that they're targeted towards the plans that they've submitted. Some of the things that you'll be able to look at in that link that was provided on the slide are the types of plans that were submitted, and see the diversity of focus areas that different schools are approaching. Some of them have some very similar paths and similar areas that they're focusing on, such as chronic absenteeism. And then there are some other specifics that really address the population of their schools. And so this continuation allows that continued support.
Thank you very much. The representative's time has expired. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. Sorry, didn't realize I was next in the sequence. Okay, I have 3. We'll see if we can get to them all. The first is, I'm generally incredibly supportive of the accountability waiver. I have mostly questions about the assessment waiver. You mentioned that you're talking about reporting out data from different assessments that are given at the school or LEA level. I want to understand how you're thinking about presenting that to the public and helping them understand what is comparable or not comparable, given that these will not be comparable in the same way that Park is.
Yeah, thanks for that important question. And I think this is an area in which we are proposing, as we sort of mentioned, this suite of approaches to doing our best to solicit and report out information that is not as good as Park, but hopefully presented in a responsible manner. So it would not be reported in the same way that we would on Park and incorporated into a STAR rating or on the report card. But we are interested in collecting broadly, for example, and we're working on some of the business rules behind this type of collection, but broadly reporting whether or not students met the anticipated benchmarks or growth of an assessment that is provided at the school or LEA level. And what that might be able to tell us is, for example, whether or not the majority of a school students or a group of students at the school were able to meet the benchmark that would be assumed, that would be a target for that group of students based on the assessment provided. Again, it is by no means as robust or as, could be used in the same way as a statewide assessment, but we hope it would provide a couple of things. One, a directional understanding of the scope or gaps still for student learning, the ability of an LEA to identify then which students needed more rigorous supports and their plan to use that information to target that. And also just as a way of holding our LEAs and schools responsible for doing that kind of work of assessing and reporting.
Okay, I'm gonna go to my second question. We heard a lot of concerns from teachers testifying to the state board about the delivery of local assessments. They were saying their students weren't all taking it seriously, or they thought the testing conditions were not ideal. So how is that better than remote assessment on something that the state provides? To say these local assessments we're going to share out results from, which teachers already have concerns about reliable and valid conditions for testing. Why is that more beneficial than a state level test administered that same way?
Yeah, thank you. Well, at minimum, I think it does not duplicate the same challenges that we see twice. I do think that the ability of those assessments are never administered under the same rigorous expectations or content delivery that the PARCC assessment would be. The expectation is a slightly different implementation in the first place. And our LEAs are already working to do their best to identify which students need extra support to complete those assessments and report back. And again, our claims are not the same in terms of what it would be able to be used for. So we think it is a better investment of time to help our teachers and their schools who are helping them engage students and have educators work directly with students on that level of learning assessment in order to better report at a broad level, sort of the direction of our student progress. And that is, again, we're working in a pandemic to do the best we can, a proxy, we think, for what we would ideally like to do and what we intend to do again next year. But it seems the most responsible way to collect the best available information on our schools and students.
Okay, thank you. My time is up.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you, John Paul, and thank you all for being here. So I have two questions. The first is just a confirmation, but the waiver would apply for the DC science assessment, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then my second question is, what would happen if the Department of Education turned down the waiver? Where would we be and what would sort of the backup plan be?
Yeah, you might win the bingo for asking this question, so thank you. Yeah, I think if indeed, first of all, we believe that our plan is strong, that it is reflective of the specific and unique context of DC, and that it is intended to respond to the U.S. Department of Education's values and our collective values of doing our best to advance academic achievement in this particular year, and to do our best to report and spend time advancing that achievement by collecting the information we know and using it toward that end. If indeed the Department of Education rejected it, we would work really specifically with them to identify the areas that they felt were concerning and try and remedy that. And so to appeal to them to identify if there were areas to remedy, and after that, try and look at other options to fulfill those needs. It's hard for me to comment. We would like to work to get to something amenable. We think our plan is strong. We obviously are here asking for the state board support in that, and we think that public comment and support would be helpful to the U.S. Department of Education. But our first request, if it were rejected, would be to work directly with them to see if we could remedy their concerns.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Patterson.
I'm good. I'll yield my time over to Representative Sutter. I believe she has another question.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. So my last question is, Alex got my one. You referenced consortia limitations on further shortening the test or administering it remotely. Who else is still part of the consortia that is administering PARCC this year that limits us from being able to do that?
Yeah, so first, I think it's first, and I'll defer to Danielle to share more. I think the intent is because it's part of a collective effort, OSSE does not just go in and change things on our own. And we have worked very hard to have a shorter form, which we think is better in the long run. But Danielle, I'll defer to you on any other detail that you want to provide.
Sure, absolutely. So the PARCC assessments, we have narrowed and made as efficient as possible with the reporting demands we have, the 5 performance levels, the scale. So that already has been made as efficient as we can. The consortial limitations was actually talking about our MSAA, our DLM, and our access assessments, where we are part of a broader consortium in each of those categories where we could not limit by ourselves, and they are not planning on limiting.
Okay, I give the rest of the time to Representative Thompson.
My question would be, given that the department has made pretty clear that they're open to flexibilities, not necessarily waivers, what would be your plan to work with the public to figure out what flexibilities you would like to implement? And are there flexibilities that and I know you said you wanted to think about working with the department if it was rejected, but are there particular flexibilities that you think would be helpful?
Yeah, thanks. I think in one of the slides that we just presented, we sort of reviewed the proactive flexibilities that the U.S. Department of Education put forward in identifying in helping to states to identify a path forward for this year. And some of those we did try very hard to identify it. And those included a shortened assessment, a longer testing window, or online assessment. Those are I believe, three of the flexibilities that they proactively suggested that states consider. And we did try very hard to consider those, and felt that on their own or in combination would not necessarily meet the needs for focusing on academic achievement in DC this year. So our proposal is something slightly alternative to that, which is requesting the option to suspend administration this year, given our intent on implementing these other paths forward, including collecting alternative information, sharing information in new ways, requiring LEAs to communicate to families, which are meeting the needs in some ways that you would use a state assessment for, in the sense of clear communication about student outcomes and using that information to drive student achievement. So if indeed the U.S. Department of Education was inclined to reject our proposal, we would have to, I think, look at the individual pieces of feedback and try and figure out what else would be amenable. But it's hard to identify upfront without, we're hopeful that they would recognize the unique situation that we're in as a state in DC.
And Representative Sullivan has a question actually via text. He wants to know if someone could ask what the timetable would be for when the testing may happen if the waiver is denied.
Again, I think we've put our best plan forward with the proposal that we do not think it's in the best interest to implement a state assessment this spring. And so it would depend greatly on the type of feedback that we heard, and I don't want to necessarily speculate on that. What we would hope is that we'd be able to come to some understanding that supports our intent to preserve that instructional time for our students who are largely attempting to return this spring.
Thank you very much. The representative's time has expired. Dr. O'Leary.
Good afternoon. So if the waiver is accepted, then what will a statewide assessment look like?
So if the waiver is accepted as we've proposed it this year, we would not administer the statewide assessments in ELA, math, or science in this school year, and we would begin again in next school year.
I understand that, but you also have to. Is it just local? Does each school or each LEA decide on what they're going to assess? That's
right. So our LEAs are implementing assessments at the school or LEA level, and we would be requesting that they submit that information to OSSE for their students in their schools. We do know that as a district, there are different assessments that each LEA gives. And our proposal would be to collect that information as it's being currently implemented in each school.
Was there any assessment given at the beginning of the year, because we knew we were in a learning loss kind of a phase when school started? Was there any assessment given system-wide about how what a reading level was for students or a math level for students?
No, we did not administer a common statewide assessment at the beginning of this year.
Is there any thought about doing that before right now in the spring so that you have something to gauge it on at the end of the school year?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we identified that it would be too, well, first, we spent a significant amount of our time trying to identify a path forward to use our traditional state assessment, which, as we talked about today, we eventually determined would not be possible. We also have, considered what it would take to purchase and implement a new assessment across all schools and determined that would not necessarily be a viable option, given the diversity of schools and their academic programs, and what it would take then to also implement something else new in the school year with the same challenges probably as what we would see in a traditional assessment.
And the last question is, you mentioned in your remarks that, or in the presentation about the state is going to provide support for the LEAs. What does that mean? In the
Sure, I
springtime
think,
for the rest of the year?
yeah, our assessment team, who has been laboring faithfully on this body of work for quite some time, would be working with individual LEAs to identify what assessments they are implementing and how best to support their reporting on that, as well as continuing, which we do all the time, and we redouble our efforts to continue our professional development and technical assistance with local assessment teams to identify how best to use this information in a comprehensive way to support student instruction, both in this school year and also in future, in the future for access to summer opportunities, or in implementing assessments at the beginning of next year.
Thank you.
Ms. Wattenberg.
Hi, everybody. So first of all, Superintendent, and to all of you, I just want to say how much I appreciate that you are filing for this. I know that sort of in general, there's a lot of concern that this isn't going to go anywhere, that other states have not been approved for it. And I just want to say, I think the argument you've made is really, really strong. And I appreciate you making it. And I hope that it gets approved. I have one substantive question, but before I get to that, I wanted to give you just a minute maybe to say something about what it would mean to proctor this with everybody not in school. I was trying to understand even how that would look, and it's an opportunity to explain why it really couldn't work.
I can give a high level review, yeah, of the challenges we think we would face that I think Danielle did a great job of sort of understanding. I think if we were to take these assessments remotely for at least some students, that student, wherever they were currently conducting school, either in a classroom, in a remote setting, at home, in a different type of classroom, wherever they are, would access the assessment via an online platform. And so the challenges with that are the ones that we would see in general, that we see with inequities in accessing school, in terms of devices and connectivity, in terms of the environment that student is in and who is around them, their ability to access a teacher for either monitoring or assistance if something went wrong, types of special accommodations that would have to be made available or would be more challenging. And we really, again, believe that part of what makes DC unique is how much we use this information. And we just really don't want to have data in which any individual student or groups of students may not have equal access to demonstrate their learning, because we use it in so many important ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I just think that's helpful. I want people to understand that. Let me ask my one substantive question, which is, as you know, one of the concerns I've always had with the way we use PARCC, which I think is a good test, and I think it's really important to have this data, is that it drives so much instruction towards math and reading because that's all that gets checked. And in this year where there's been limited instruction anyway, there's some sense that there's been a special focus on math and reading. When you have in here, require the LEAs to submit plans and how their schools are using local interim assessments to drive instruction, use that data to target state provided supports. Can you give any of us some confidence that that will be interpreted in a way that will allow schools to say, and you didn't get your social studies. And one of the reasons that you're not reading at a high comprehension level is you didn't get your content this year, et cetera, et cetera?
I'm trying to think of how to answer that question. I think one of the things that we anticipate is that we will be collecting information that is related to reading and math in the assessments that we are soliciting in order to have a common, as common a possible set of sort of standard information collection from LEAs. We also similarly, we would be happy to collect information on other types of assessments as well for social studies and science. And similarly, as we talked about, we've been very excited to implement our science assessment at the state level, and one of the reasons that we would propose to suspend it this year is so that we can preserve that assessment to be ready next year. But I think that, and I think there's other parts of the content we could get into about the types of core content that is used in the PARCC assessment for reading and math that overlaps with social studies and science. But I think broadly, our intent here is to collect information that will reflect as best possible the student progress in support of both English and English language arts and math, but also, like you said, to support, driving academic progress for the whole child in multiple subject areas.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gasoy, did you have questions?
I have one. I mean, again, first, I just want to say thank you for first of all, the thoughtful work that went into putting this together and going forward, as my colleagues have said, with, something that seems bold at this point. So my question is around support as well. And just wondering if there'll be a way of tracking the kinds of supports that schools need and what will be administered.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of ways we're thinking about LEA support at this point. One of the things we talked about in the collection of information from schools is, we sort of mentioned this, is that we're collecting plans from schools. And part of the information we're collecting is part of the broader continuous education plan that we are requiring from all LEAs, which will require not only this collection and documentation of how our schools are using assessments, but also their intent on how to use them to inform instruction and what their instructional plans look like in the next year, as well as for specific groups of students that we know to be most at risk or need extra support in terms of English language learners, students with disabilities, specific categories of students such as at-risk students. So our supports at the OSCE level will include a suite of technical assistance, professional development. We'll be investing our federal funds, using this information to see which schools have more robust or less robust plans to target who has access to certain kinds of funding and other types of professional development, and to lead people in that direction. So I feel like I could talk about this for a long time. But it will be used in a number of different areas, both for like required technical assistance and supportive professional development.
And is that something that the public would be able to see, like what is being done?
Yeah, yes. So
like, will you be reporting out on?
Yeah, the continuous education plans themselves will be public. The investments that the state makes in different kinds of professional development will also be public. Certain types of participation in those efforts will also be public as they're made available, but it will depend a little bit on which types of things those are, as well as different kinds of traditionally public monitoring efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chang.
Thank you. Hi, Shauna. I appreciate all of you coming in to talk with us today. My question focuses around how the board can help support you right now. I'm curious what some of the misunderstandings are that you're finding that we may help clarify with our constituents, what feedback we can get from our constituents, or what other ways we may help you move this forward?
Thank you so much for that question. So I think there's a couple of things. First, we do have a public comment period open, and we would appreciate, first, we'd appreciate the state boards. We do appreciate and would continue to appreciate the state board support to have written comment that supports this waiver that is reflective of the, of all of our communities that you represent. We would appreciate elevating and publicizing this to your communities and sharing why we intend to do this, and as well as our continued commitment to collecting information on the progress of our students and why we think this is appropriate now, but in the broader context of why we think student progress is important. So sharing this and soliciting public comment from other of the communities that you represent would also be very helpful. I think it will be helpful to our waiver application to show that we have public support of this effort, and also public support for the continued focus on student outcomes and on future reporting there.
Are you finding that there are misunderstandings around the process right now from constituents that we ought to be helping to clarify?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not sure that there are common misunderstandings so much as, I think there's concern about what it would look like as we work to bring more and more of our students in person, or to finish out the year strong, regardless of the location of the learning, to have to pivot to assessment in the spring seems overwhelming and challenging for a number of families. And we also think that it's important. I mean, we are used to implementing a statewide assessment and overcoming that anxiety in many ways. This year is particularly unusual. And so we do want to focus on academic outcomes in a different way than we would have to in a different year. And so I think, again, this is not sort of taking our foot off the gas, but it is just changing a little bit of the direction in this unique year.
I also think, Shauna, it's important to sort of convey the message that we're operating in good faith here. I think when you go and read our 14-page waiver, you will see an extensive detailing of all of the efforts that we took to go multiple routes in order to fulfill the commitments under the law, and then to say, and this is why we could not do that. So it wasn't us just making a futile attempt to say, oh, can't do it, or none of our kids are going to do it. Like, we took a lot of time, Danielle took a lot of time to think about different options. And at the end of the day, it led to the same result. Not really good, meaningful information that our stakeholders find important to understand the performance of our schools.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate that clarification.
Thank you. President Parker.
Thank you for joining us, Superintendent and the IC team. Again, 2 quick points, and then I'm going to get to my question. One, I know IC is often criticized. And again, I want to reiterate my appreciation for the way in which you've leaned in with the board, but also making sure that the public is aware of what's in this application and the process. So thank you. I would also say, as I was reading through the application, I was struck by some of the irony in what I perceive IC making some of the same arguments that I've heard from educators, teachers, and school leaders about, for instance, how much time testing takes from instructional time. And so therefore, not administering PARC will then give educators more time in the classroom. So I just want to call out that irony as well. 3 specific questions. One, I know, Superintendent, you didn't want to get ahead of the decision, but can we at least commit to educators and parents that there will not be a state assessment this spring, regardless of the U.S. Department of Education's decision?
Yeah, I have to be really respectful of the U.S. Department of Education's authority here. It is our great intent not to do that. But the U.S. Department of Education is the decider and is the one responsible for approving a waiver and or negotiating or requiring any other next steps. So I want to be respectful of that authority and very clear that we are requesting something with we think very good evidence, and if it were rejected, we would make every effort to fulfill what we think is our value and the best interest of DC in this year. But I want to just be respectful of the process and of the authority of the U.S. Department of Education. We would certainly look if they challenged it or felt it wasn't approvable, to see where they felt the most concerning areas were and try and remedy that to get it approvable.
Understood. I won't push you on that, but it is my understanding that the flexibilities do allow for different timeframes of administration. And my concern would be that if the U.S. Department of Education were to come back and say the application is denied, we then turn around and say to parents, psych, we are going to have park testing. I think that would be devastating, to say the least, in terms of trust and a host of other issues. My other question is, it's kind of dovetails with what Representative Sutter was getting at earlier in terms of LEAs having comparable assessments. Is there a catalog of assessments that LEAs are administering? Do we know that if they're having the same issues that you all are citing in your application in terms of administration, fidelity, et cetera? And how are we ensuring that this requirement that you're placing in the application isn't going to cause undue burden to LEAs? In other words, do they then need to run out and get an assessment system? Do they need to change how they're operating around their assessments if they, for instance, aren't administering them on the same cycles that they were before?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is first completely fair that there's a trade-off for not administering the state assessment. We do know that our LEAs are administering other types of assessments. We collected some of this information in the continuous education plans from last year. There are a number of assessments that are common and are used by a plurality of schools that I could refer to by name, including the MAP and iReady and ANET provide some common set of assessments. So we know there are a number of schools and LEAs that administer common assessments. And so that gives us some confidence. And some are administering other types of locally designed assessments aligned to their curriculum. And we think it is appropriate that they administer those and that they report back on that progress of their students towards those, towards the outcomes of those assessments. So it should not be a burden to LEAs. It is a change to have to report it to the state and share it publicly, but we think that's an appropriate exchange because it is not the same burden of the statewide assessment, and so we think it's appropriate that they report back on their current activity to fulfill the commitment to transparency and having some information to guide the city.
So President Parker's on his way back in. His internet just dropped.
So one thing, John Paul, I see.
Sure.
Go ahead. So I see in the chatter some really interesting discussion regarding what other states are doing. I mean, states. This is the beauty of sort of states, and they're going to design a whole lot of different things. But I think it's important to remember it's not just what people are doing operationally to administer a test. It's the quality of the information that they're going to get back. That is the key fundamental questioning. There's an infinite number of arrangements you can do if your goal is just to administer a test. Like this kid, not that kid, that group, that school, not that school. You can do a whole bunch of things. But is it going to give you a comprehensive, meaningful look at everybody in your school so you can, or in your state, so you can do something with it? I think is the real challenge here. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
Thanks, Justin.
My internet dropped right while you were responding. I will not ask you to repeat, but thank you. Members, are there additional questions? I'm just scanning the chat. Representative Sutter had a question around other state sampling. Representative Sutter, feel free to jump in and ask your question.
Yeah, so that's what Justin was just talking about. And I totally respect that, Justin, that I'm not suggesting that other states have done this. Why don't we do this? My question is, in light of what the department's guidance says and our examination of our local context and your good point around, we can test in any number of iterations, but what kind of quality information will we get back? I remain a little concerned about the quality of information we may get back even under waiver conditions, given that we know there's so many different kinds of assessment schools give, given teacher testimony to the board about the conditions under which students are testing in those situations. So my question remains, how does that help us gain a waiver versus administering a statewide test? How is that sort of a justification to the department? I do want to acknowledge that the superintendent made clear that the expectation is schools are already doing these interims anyway. We're simply not adding an extra burden. So I hear that argument loud and clear. I'm still unsure whether I think the department will concur.
Yeah, I appreciate that caution. And I think we are in good faith looking at what we can do, again, to hold LEAs responsible for attention to learning, how they are using their individual information to help drive decision-making for their students, right? And the reporting back to us is not the same. It's not the same as the way we would use PARC, but it is a good faith effort on the LEAs to demonstrate their work, right? To say, in this year where we would usually have a state assessment, we are taking the steps at the school level to give an assessment, to understand what it means to the best of our ability, to use it in ways that are responsible, to help drive student learning and to drive resources, and to share that back with the state so that we can get a directional sense of what that looks like in our schools. And that could mean a directional sense of student outcomes. It could also mean a directional sense of the strengths and weaknesses of LEA work, in what ways they are using, they're collecting and using information in a smart way, and in creative ways to drive outcomes. And so I think, you know, we would never be the first people to say, or any people to say this is the same as PARC. We know it's not. But we also think there's ways to be creative and responsible in what we require of people this year. And we would hope that the U.S. Department of Education would see it again as a good faith effort of focusing on that academic outcomes and the way we can use information that we do have to drive meaningful change. And I think similarly, we don't want, one of the reasons we did not consider things like sampling or other things is that we want to follow the Secretary of Education's guidance and the Department of Education's guidance not to recall students back to the building just for testing. And right now we are in the middle of an uptake effort to get students back in buildings in a very particular kind of operational change that is maybe different than other jurisdictions. And so we want to make sure that we're able to focus on that work and think that this strikes the right balance. But I agree, like we think it's certainly unusual, but we wanted to lay out as clearly as possible our attempt. I would say also my assessment team wants to remind us that actually sampling in a meaningful way for outcomes is very hard in DC because of our small size. So to actually mathematically do things like sampling in a way that is meaningful, we did investigate, but identified that it would not be a meaningful path forward from an assessment perspective.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I really appreciate it.
Representative O'Leary has another question.
Yes, I have a question. You had in your presentation, it said there was, in the second term, it was 96% attendance. From what I hear from teachers and principals that I talk to, are those the students who have signed on to come to the Canvas period? Because I know a lot of teachers don't even ever see their students, and the students don't participate.
No, I apologize. I think that was not 96% of attendance. That was 96% of students were in a distance learning posture, meaning that they were attending via virtual learning as opposed to in the building. And that number is growing in term 3 and term 4. More students are in buildings, but the 96% was not an attendance rate. It was the rate at which students were learning virtually.
Okay, but 96 is only 4 points away. I'm not a math person, but it's only 4 points away from 100% attendance. And the grades don't reflect that by any stretch of the imagination. So, I mean, I don't think that number, because then you're not the only entity that gives that 96% or a 90% attendance rate as something that's a plus. And I don't think that that's fair to even publicize that.
No, I just want to clarify again, that is not an attendance rate. We were not saying that that was 96% attendance. We were saying.
That's what it said.
I can have our team check back again on the language, but we're happy to correct it if that's what it says. That's not an attendance rate. That's 96% of the students in quarter 2 who were virtual learning.
Who signed on at least one time? Is that what that means?
Meaning that they were not assigned to go to the building for school. Their assignment was not to go to school in person.
No, I know, but how do you, I mean, was it 96% had entered their computer on to something and that's what the number came from?
No.
Well, I don't understand what you're saying it is.
Representative O'Leary, I will ask that the OSCE team meet offline with you to clarify those questions.
Okay.
Just to make sure you get clarity there. Representative Thompson has an additional question.
Yeah, Fraser, I think she's saying 90% of students are receiving virtual instruction. No, not the quality of attendance. That's just the option of learning that they're in. That's it. That's no more than that. I guess my question is about the option of a fall testing window. Now, I know that you all said that's not the preference and that there are other things that you think would be important to prioritize. And I agree with you that things like reentry and social emotional well-being are important. But I'm curious about the argument that it would be too late to have the data to inform instruction. We heard from teachers that a lot of times PARC data comes too late for them to adjust instruction anyway. And would there not be if the waiver wasn't granted, would there not be a value at least in just having a baseline to be able to compare a statewide assessment to a statewide assessment, granted not over a true year, but just over a period of time? I mean, I totally believe that you all put a lot of thought into this, and I totally understand why the case for I get it. I also am someone who is inclined to believe that this will be rejected by the Department of Ed, not because of the quality of what you all have put forth, but because of their stated kind of priorities and what we're seeing nationally. So I'm curious to know if we had to go a route of other flexibilities, would there be some value in possibly a fall flexibility, given most of our students will not be in person in the spring?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And again, we did a significant amount of consideration before we decided to request this. And I think there's a number of reasons why. I think first, assessing in any form, either a traditional PARC assessment in the fall or a modified, would still receive our results back a couple of months later than we gave them. And so, and concurrently, our schools will be giving earlier diagnostic, the fall, August, September rollout of MAP. And so we would be doing those things relatively concurrently and getting back the state modified assessment in the fall, later in the fall towards the winter. And I think we, from a hardcore assessment psychometric perspective, the question would be, what would it be a baseline for, right? It wouldn't exactly be the same as a spring assessment, and it wouldn't exactly be the same as a MAP in the fall. And so it would be something new, and we would have to think about the return on investment, so to speak, for the administration of it, how we would interpret it, what it would be valid to be used for, in the context of the other type of recovery of unfinished learning or closure learning in the fall. And that's why we didn't, I agree, it's certainly something that we would have to consider, but I think we also really want to think about the ways in which we use our assessment data and in what way this would be the same or different, and how it would be meaningful to us if we did it. And those things I think we want to take very cautiously, which is why we requested this other approach with a significant amount of, rigor towards using the information we have now to push forward into next year. But I appreciate the question. It's a complicated one, and certainly one we would have to reassess. We were not convinced at the time when we've done this analysis that it would be the most meaningful way to proceed, either from a traditional assessment perspective or from an instructional perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, Superintendent, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate the effort and attention the OSCE team is putting into this application, and we look forward to submitting our official testimony as part of that application. And we also encourage members of the public to be sure to get your testimony in by the April 2nd deadline. And again, you can send that to osce.assessment@dc.gov. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us and for the robust discussion. I really appreciate your thoughtful feedback. Thank you.
Members, we will now turn briefly to entertain any new business. Is there new business that any members would like to elevate at this time? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn our meeting for today.
So moved.
It has been moved by Representative Sutter and seconded by Representative O'Leary. But all in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. All opposed, please say nay. The ayes have it. This meeting of the State Board is adjourned at 6:20 p.m. Thank you again for members of the public joining this special meeting. Good night.
See y'all.
Good night. Safe travels, Zachary.
Thank you.